There is a plant my grandmother used to grow behind her house, and for years I thought it was just a strange family tree, something she had brought from another life and kept alive out of habit. It was tall, almost as tall as the porch roof. It had wide heart-shaped leaves that looked tropical and out of place in that corner of Tennessee. And every autumn, it would fill with clusters of egg-shaped fruits hanging like ornaments from its branches. She called them tree tomatoes. She would pick them by the basket, carry them to the kitchen, and turn them into sauces, chutneys, and a tart jam that she stored in glass jars on a wooden shelf in the pantry. Those jars lasted us through the winter, and the plant, that single plant, kept producing year after year for as long as I can remember. I never thought about it then. To me, it was just part of the landscape. But years later, when I started growing food seriously and began to understand how much work an ordinary tomato plant demands, how short its season is, how quickly it dies, I started to wonder what exactly my grandmother had been growing all those years. Because whatever it was, it did not behave like any tomato I had ever known. When I finally tracked down its real name, I was shocked. Not because the plant was rare or exotic, but because of how completely it had disappeared from the world I lived in. Nobody around me had heard of it. No garden center sold it. No gardening magazine talked about it. And yet, less than 100 years ago, it had been promoted as one of the most promising fruit plants in North American agriculture. The plant is called tamarillo. Its scientific name is Solanum betaceum, formerly classified as Sipho-Mandra betacea. It is a perennial relative of the tomato, native to the Andean regions of South America. And for a brief period in the early 20th century, it looked like it was going to change how American families grew food. Then something happened. Within about 2 decades, it vanished from American gardens so completely that most people today have never even heard the word tamarillo. The plant did not stop working. Nothing replaced it that was actually better. It was simply pushed out of the conversation until even its memory faded. Let me describe what this plant actually is, because once you understand what it does, the strangeness of its disappearance becomes harder to ignore. Tamarillo is a fast-growing perennial shrub or small tree. In 2 or 3 years, it reaches between 8 and 12 feet tall. The leaves are large, soft, and heart-shaped, almost tropical in appearance, and they cover the plant so densely that it can serve as a green screen in a garden. From the 2nd year onward, the plant produces clusters of egg-shaped fruits, around 2 to 3 inches long, hanging in groups from the upper branches. Depending on the variety, the fruits ripen to red, orange, or yellow. The skin is smooth and shiny. The flesh inside is dense, slightly tart, faintly sweet, with a flavor that is hard to compare to anything else. It carries a hint of tomato, a touch of passion fruit, and a whisper of something floral that is entirely its own. You can eat them raw if you peel them. You can slice them into salads. You can cook them down into thick sauces that taste like an upgraded tomato base. You can turn them into chutneys, jams, and preserves. You can even dry them. And here is the detail that stops people when they hear it. Fresh tamarillo, stored in cool conditions, keeps for 4 to 6 months, not in a freezer, not in a jar, just sitting in a cool room or cellar. Compare that to an ordinary tomato. A tomato is good for a few days on the counter and maybe 2 weeks if you are lucky. A tamarillo lasts an entire season. That alone changes what it means to grow your own food. But the differences do not end there, and this is where the story really begins to shift. A mature tamarillo plant produces between 50 and 100 pounds of fruit per year. In ideal conditions, some sources report as much as 150 pounds. Production begins in the 2nd year after planting and reaches full capacity by the 3rd, and then the plant keeps producing for 20 to 30 years from that same single planting. Let me do the math out loud, because I think it is important to hear it stated plainly. One tamarillo plant, producing on average 75 pounds of fruit per year over a lifespan of 25 years, gives you somewhere around 1,800 pounds of food from one act of planting. A tomato plant produces between 10 and 30 pounds of fruit in a single season. Then it dies. You replant it next year. Over 25 years, assuming you replant every spring and average around 25 pounds per plant, that same garden spot gives you around 625 pounds total. One tamarillo gives you 3 times more food in the same space, and you only had to plant it once. And there is more. In mild and subtropical climates, tamarillos do not produce in one short summer burst the way tomatoes do. They produce for many months, often through autumn and into winter, exactly when other gardens have gone quiet. In tropical climates, they can fruit almost continuously. In California, before the plants were largely abandoned, they were producing harvestable fruit from July all the way through December. Imagine picking fresh fruit from your own garden in late November while everyone else is buying winter tomatoes shipped from across the continent. That is what tamarillo offers. And the plant asks for very little in return. Once established, tamarillos need only moderate watering. They are relatively resistant to the pests and diseases that plague tomatoes. They do not need staking. They do not need pruning, although careful pruning can improve yield. They do not need rich fertilizing or constant attention. You plant them, water them while they establish their roots, and after that they mostly take care of themselves. Compare that to growing tomatoes. Every year you start seeds or buy transplants. You harden them off. You amend the soil. You stake or cage them. You prune the suckers. You watch for blight, hornworms, blossom end rot, fusarium wilt. You water constantly. You fertilize. You harvest for a few intense weeks. And then everything dies, and you do it all over again next year. The amount of labor that goes into tomato production every season is enormous. Tamarillo demands a fraction of that work for far greater long-term yield. So why on earth would anyone choose tomatoes? The honest answer is familiarity. People grow what they know. They grow what their neighbors grow, what the garden center sells, what the seed catalog shows on the cover. And tamarillo disappeared before most of us had the chance to even know it existed, let alone compare it to anything. To understand how that happened, you have to look at what changed in American agriculture during the middle of the 20th century. In the 1930s and 40s, tamarillo cultivation in the United States was growing. Agricultural extension agents were promoting the plant. Nurseries in California, Florida, and across the South were selling young trees. Home gardeners were planting them, and they performed beautifully. During the Second World War, tamarillo became particularly valued in victory gardens because it produced abundant food with very little input. People were learning to grow food efficiently because they had to, and tamarillo fit that need perfectly. Then the war ended, and the entire American food system began to transform. Industrial agriculture took over the post-war landscape. The model shifted toward annual crops, hybrid seeds, chemical fertilizers, and synthetic pesticides. Perennial food plants did not fit this model at all. You cannot sell annual seeds to a customer growing perennial trees. You cannot sell fertilizers and pesticides to a plant that does not need them. Tamarillo was simply too independent, too self-sufficient. At the same time, the tomato industry exploded. Plant breeders developed hybrid varieties designed for disease resistance, uniform ripening, and most importantly, the ability to survive long-distance shipping. Enormous research budgets went into perfecting the commercial tomato. Tamarillo received nothing. It does not ship well. It is perennial. It does not fit annual production cycles. The commercial industry had no reason to invest in promoting an alternative that would compete with its primary product. Then suburban culture changed gardening itself. The new aesthetic favored neat annual flower beds and small vegetable plots. Perennial fruit trees were seen as old-fashioned, agricultural, rural. Tamarillo is a small tree. It does not fit a raised bed or a tidy suburban border. And from a commercial standpoint, a customer who plants a tamarillo and harvests from it for 20 years is a customer the garden center has effectively lost. They do not come back every spring for new tomato plants. They do not buy seed packets or starter trays. They simply walk into their own backyard and pick fruit. Agricultural extension services also shifted their focus after the war. They began catering more to commercial farmers than to home growers. And because tamarillo is not a major commercial crop in the United States, Extension stopped promoting it. Without that institutional support, knowledge about how to grow it began to fade from one generation to the next. And then nature delivered the final blow. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, several unusually cold winters hit California and parts of the southern United States. Tamarillo is frost-tender. It tolerates light frost, but a hard freeze kills it to the ground. Established plants died across the regions where it had been most popular. People did not replant. Nurseries stopped carrying it because demand had dropped. Within a single generation, the plant went from common to forgotten. But here is what makes this story suspicious. Tamarillo did not disappear everywhere. It thrived in New Zealand, where it became a significant commercial crop and where the name tamarillo was actually coined in the 1960s for marketing purposes. It continued to be grown across South America. It became established in parts of Australia. The plant did not fail. It succeeded everywhere except in the country with the most aggressive industrial food system, the country where seed companies, garden centers, and grocery store chains profit the most from keeping people dependent on annual gardening cycles. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. A plant that produces decades of food from a single planting threatens multiple industries at once. It threatens seed companies, who cannot sell you new seeds every spring. It threatens garden centers, who cannot sell you new transplants. It threatens grocery store produce sections, who cannot sell you tomatoes year-round when you are harvesting your own. It threatens fertilizer and pesticide companies, who cannot sell inputs to a plant that does not need them. The entire model of modern home gardening, the model that assumes you will replant every year, buy fresh seeds every spring, replace your soil amendments every season, collapses the moment people discover that perennial alternatives exist and actually outperform annuals. So tamarillo was quietly removed from the conversation. Nobody banned it, nobody made it illegal. It was simply not promoted, not stocked, not mentioned, not taught. And within about 20 years, it slipped out of common knowledge so thoroughly that most American gardeners today have no idea it ever existed. Now let me tell you how to actually grow this plant, because tamarillo still exists. Seeds are available through specialty seed companies. Young plants can be ordered online from nurseries that focus on rare and perennial fruits. And in the right climate, the plant is not difficult to grow. Tamarillo needs frost-free or nearly frost-free conditions. It is hardy down to about 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Light frost will not kill it, but a hard freeze will. This makes it well-suited as a perennial in USDA Zones 9 through 11, which covers parts of California, Florida, the Gulf Coast, southern Arizona, and southern Texas. In colder zones, it can still be grown in large containers and brought indoors during the winter months. Some people in colder regions even grow it as an annual, although that defeats the entire advantage of the plant. Plant tamarillo in full sun or partial shade. It prefers well-drained soil but tolerates a wide range of conditions. Give each plant 6 to 8 feet of space, because they grow quickly and need room for their canopy. Water regularly during the first year while the root system establishes itself. After that, the plant becomes quite drought-tolerant, though steady moisture improves production. Tamarillo begins producing in its second year and reaches full production by the third. Harvest the fruits when they are fully colored and yield just slightly to gentle pressure. Do not pull them off. Cut the stem with shears or pruners to avoid damaging the branches. Stored at cool room temperature, the fruit lasts for weeks. In a proper cool cellar or unheated pantry, it lasts for months. You can also freeze it, cook it down into sauces, turn it into jams, or dry slices for later use. Prune the plant lightly to shape it and remove any dead wood. Heavy pruning can reduce production, but moderate pruning helps control size and improves airflow. Feed the plant occasionally with a balanced organic fertilizer or a layer of compost around the base, but do not overfeed. Pests are minimal. You may see aphids on tender new growth occasionally. But serious infestations are rare. Diseases are uncommon compared to the constant battles you face with ordinary tomatoes. The biggest challenge in marginal climates is cold protection. If you are in Zone 8 or in a borderline area of Zone 9 where hard freezes occasionally arrive, you will need to take precautions. Mulch heavily around the base of the plant going into winter. Cover the plant during freeze warnings with frost cloth or burlap. Plant it in a sheltered location near a south-facing wall, under tree canopy, or in a courtyard where it has protection from the worst of the cold. In truly cold regions, container growing is the answer. A large container, moved indoors for the coldest months, allows you to grow tamarillo even in areas where it would never survive outside. I want you to picture what this plant offers in practical terms. One tamarillo tree in your backyard. You plant it once. By year 3, you are harvesting 50 to 100 pounds of fruit every year. You are eating fresh fruit in October, November, and December when most gardens are bare. You are storing fruit in a cool pantry that stays good for months. You are making sauces, chutneys, and jams that fill your shelves. You are giving fruit away to neighbors who have never tasted anything like it. And you are doing this with a fraction of the work that ordinary tomato gardening demands, for 20 to 30 years, from one planting. That is not a fantasy. That is what people were doing across the southern United States in the 1940s before this plant was quietly erased from American memory. So the question that matters now is what you do with this information. If you live in zones 9 through 11, you can plant a tamarillo this year. Find a reputable seed company or specialty nursery. Order seeds or a young plant. Pick a sunny corner of your garden. Give it room to grow. Take care of it for the first season while it establishes. And then begin a relationship with a plant that will feed you for decades. If you live in Zone 8, try one in a protected location or a large movable container. Experiment. Learn what works in your microclimate. And if you live in a colder zone, you can still grow tamarillo in a large pot, bringing it indoors during winter. The plant adapts surprisingly well to container life as long as the container is large enough. And once you grow it, share what you learn. Take cuttings. Tamarillo roots easily from semi-hardwood cuttings, which means one plant can become many. Give cuttings to your neighbors. Talk about the plant. Tell people what it is and what it does. Break the silence that allowed this plant to disappear in the first place. Every person who plants a tamarillo and harvests from it for 20 years is a person who stops needing to buy tomato plants every spring. One plant at a time, the dependence on annual gardening cycles weakens. One garden at a time, the memory of perennial food returns. This is not just about tamarillo. There are dozens of forgotten perennial fruits and vegetables that were once common in American gardens and have now slipped out of view. Plants that produce more food with less work than the annuals we have been taught to grow. Plants that were buried for the same reasons tamarillo was buried, because they made people too independent and too disconnected from the commercial food chain. Reviving these plants is not just a hobby. It is a quiet way of rebuilding food security one backyard at a time. It is recognizing that the model we have been handed, the model of replanting everything every year and depending on seed catalogs and garden centers, is not the only way and never was the best way. The plant better than tomatoes is tamarillo. It produces for months instead of weeks. It stores for half a year without freezing or canning. It lives for decades from one planting. It feeds a family with very little work. And it was buried so thoroughly that most of us forgot it ever existed. Now you know. The knowledge that disappeared has returned to your hands. What you do with it is up to you. If you enjoy discovering forgotten crops and reclaiming the kind of practical knowledge that quietly changes how a household feeds itself, subscribe to the channel and join us in the next video.